Okay, I think we're going to start. This has a absolutely delightful feeling of deja vu about it, because this is the first resumed part of the Conduit's programming, and I cannot tell you how both delighted and emotional I am at the prospect of having such an enormously important topic be our inaugural session. A quick little piece of housekeeping. Next week, on the 9th of June at 6 p.m., there will be a town hall meeting in our second session, which will be roughly everything you ever wanted to know about the new Conduit in Covent Garden, but we're afraid to ask. Jema Powell, co-managing director of Leaders Quest, will be in conversation with myself and Joel Williams to tell you everything about the new building, our new home, everything that is going to be new and interesting and exciting about the Conduit's new home. And with that, I just wanted to say a very warm welcome to all of you. As you know, our programming focuses on a range of different topics, from climate to economic inequality, to women's empowerment, to racial equity, to global health, to skills and learning. And the Conduit is a community of people who are passionate about positive social change, and we gather together to try and see the extent to which we can accelerate progress in all of those areas, and to particularly cultivate entrepreneurial approaches to tackling those pressing global problems. And I think we would also agree that if we made enormous progress on all of those fronts, but somewhere in the world, a significant number of people were suffering systemic human rights abuse, it would color and tarnish and render all those other accomplishments incomplete. And we would not rest if a group of people, however they may be in a minority, however unpopular they may be, are being subject to gross violations of human rights. And it's in that context that I think this particular topic to discuss the circumstances in which the Uyghurs in China live is particularly relevant. And we have with us an incredibly distinguished panel. We have Baroness Helena Kennedy, who is a barrister, a QC, a member of the House of Lords, and a very active voice in human rights. We have Sir Geoffrey QC, who is chair of the Uyghur Tribunal, but also known to many as the person who led the prosecution of Slobodan Milosevic at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And we have Luke de Pulford, who is director of the Arise Foundation and also co-founder of the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, which Helena, not coincidentally, co-chairs. And so this is an extraordinarily both august and knowledgeable panel. And I wanted to kick off. I just wanted to say we will leave time for people to ask questions. This is a knowledgeable and loquacious group, so I'm going to ask them to keep their answers to 2 or 3 minutes, so there is indeed time. But we will give you an opportunity to ask questions. Please put those questions in the Q&A chat at the bottom of Zoom. You all know that by now, and I will try and select out as many as I can, and apologies in advance if I don't get all of them. So I'm going to, and this session will be recorded, and we will be able to put it in the Conduit archive so people will be able to view it afterwards, and also people who didn't get to watch it live will be able to watch it as part of our archive. So I'm going to kick off with Luke. I think for you, the situation in China, and particularly with the Uyghurs, may seem something that is upsettingly familiar, but I think it would be useful for people who have a vague knowledge, but not necessarily an expert knowledge, just to set out why this is a matter of global concern, what the allegations are in terms of the experiences and the suffering of the Uyghurs, so that we can create a bit of a backdrop against which to have this conversation.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. It's a privilege to be here with two friends, but also two friends from wildly differing angles on the political spectrum, just in case everybody thinks that we're of a mind on that. We definitely aren't. So the state of play at the moment in northwest China, the persecution of minorities in China is not new. I've personally been involved in campaigning on behalf of those who've been persecuted because of their ethnicity or religion in China for well over a decade. But you're right that since 2017, a massive crackdown on Uyghurs and other predominantly Turkic minorities began. So what do we know, given the fact that access to that region is extraordinarily difficult and that China repeatedly refuses to allow independent, impartial investigators into the area? Well, we know, mainly from Chinese government data, that there are 380 plus detention facilities in which we think there are well over 1 million Uyghurs and other predominantly Turkic Muslims, sometimes not Muslims at all, Kazakhs and Christians, held extrajudicially within those camps. We know that there is credible evidence of forced sterilization. Again, this is analysis from the Chinese government's own data. In the words of our own foreign secretary, which our government hasn't been chomping at the bit to criticize China, this is an area of the world where there is torture on an industrial scale. That's a quote, a direct quote from him. We also hear lots of reports of family separation. Some have claimed that the figure of children taken from their families and re-educated is in the hundreds of thousands, and there are increasing reports of forced organ harvesting. So that's the evidence we've managed to glean without actually being able to get there. My particular interest in this comes from my work on modern slavery. I run an anti-slavery NGO, and I was increasingly disturbed that slavery perpetrated by the Chinese government was rarely, if ever, spoken about within our community. Basically, we've been giving China a free pass on this in the mistaken hope that it would open up and that it would democratize. And I think that my personal view for some years has been that Uyghurs and others deserve better than that. And forced labor is rife in the region, not just Uyghurs in camps, but it also affects so-called labor transfer schemes or vocational training schemes, which are schemes where the government takes Uyghurs from camps and sends them to other parts of China. It's involuntary labor. There's a lot of research about that. So we think that there are about 83 brands implicated in a major report from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Renewable energies, you've already heard about this. That technology is implicated too. Polysilicon production involved in that. Chinese soda companies are linked to the camps. Tomatoes, cotton, how many are bound up in all of that? We don't know, but people speculate it's at least 80,000. And that's, again, according to the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, the likely number being much higher. So that's a snapshot of the state of play. The reason it matters to us is because of our international obligations and our commitment to human rights. But there is another facet here. It matters to us because of China's rise and the increasing threat that China poses to the international community and the rest of the world. The way that it views human rights and the way that it is treating minorities in its own country has ramifications far beyond its borders. So those are all the reasons that I've been focusing on this, and I hope that gives you a bit of an overview.
Absolutely, thank you very much. So, Helen, I'd like to ask you a question, because you have engaged with this both as a barrister with a distinguished human rights track record, but also as a person who sits in the House of Lords. And this is a matter which is has come before the UK Parliament, and the UK Parliament has pronounced on this. And what would you say to a kind of skeptic who said, this is a piece of China bashing, it's part of a kind of great powers slow the rise of China, and is not really properly a human rights matter at all. It's a great powers game of diplomacy that has occasioned the UK Parliament of being seized of this matter?
Well, I don't know that there are too many people who would see me as being a hawk when it comes to international relations, and of course, and undoubtedly, there are people who see this as this human rights issue are often, well, some are people who have not been very interested in human rights before. And so it becomes a very important lever to use in a different project, which is the project of restraining China in its rise to become a superpower and to keep it in its box. My position on this comes out of my background in human rights. And I now run an Institute of Human Rights for the International Bar Association, and I've been doing that for 2 years. And I do that alongside my own practice. And across my desk, I started receiving 2 years ago increasing communications from exiled Uyghurs and from the Uyghur Congress, bringing to my attention what was happening. And I then started meeting sort of online and in different ways with people who are Uyghur exiles. And all I can tell you is that I have slowly become persuaded that, the evidence is there, as Lucas just said. The evidence is pretty persuasive of gross human rights abuses. And of course, China, that's not new. We've known a lot about China's human rights abuses for a long time. But the particular thing of directing this against, as Lucas said, the Tajik peoples who are in particular parts of China, and really, eliminating their culture, their religion, their language, and of course it started really under that banner which human rights abusers the world over have used, which is just like the West, we're dealing with Islamic terrorism, and so they've maintained that that's what their position is. But in answer to your question, I do think there might some people who really want to use this for hawkish reasons and want another kind of Cold War and to keep China in its place. I do think that we have a very different kind of leader in China now, in Xi, and I think he is expanding the reach of China in ways that are new. And the Belt and Roads policy of going into places like Pakistan, all over Africa, and building the infrastructure and lending money and so on, makes, of course, all those nations indebted, which, of course, then makes any kind of calling to account for abuses more difficult, because none of the African countries, for example, would vote in criticism of China because they can't. And so that reach of power is certainly taking place, and that does concern me, because it means that you don't get there's no compliance with the rules-based order that we believed came into existence after the Second World War, and which has been built up to include not just the rule of law, but human rights. And I don't think China is compliant with that, and I do think that they're spreading that kind of disregard for that rules-based order. So I do have concerns about it, but I certainly wouldn't be in the crowd that fly the flag for hawkishness. And I do think that is different. But it's very interesting. You mentioned that Luke was very much at the heart of creating this incredible project of the Interparliamentary Alliance. That's parliaments all around the world, basically recognizing that sometimes the UN can't be the place that will be effective on certain issues. And so this is I co-chair the UK end of it, and I do so with a conservative, Ian Duncan Smith, with whom I disagree on most other bits of politics, but he's very, very strong on the business of human rights abuses. And so, but there are people from Germany, Japan, Australia, Canada, United States. There are parliamentarians from around the world who have joined in on this effort to address the problems of what is taking place in China just now towards the Uyghur.
Right. So one of the debates about this matter, and Geoffrey, I'm going to turn to you now, is about the proper forum to make determinations or characterizations of the kinds of crimes that have occurred in China with respect to the Uyghurs. And some people have said it's for Parliament to pass resolutions to seek to characterize what's occurred. The UK government has said it's really the role of courts. And you have chosen a different path through the establishment of the Uyghur Tribunal, which you head. Will you tell, for those people, which incidentally begins this Friday, would you tell those people who may not know what the Uyghur Tribunal is, what its role is, and what it is that you are seeking to achieve? And you're on mute, Geoffrey.
Always been a lousy advocate. Being mute is the high point of that. Thank you very much for involving me in this. Before I say anything else, I have to make it clear, of course, I express absolutely no opinions on anything concerning the Uyghurs, because we start on Friday, we start with a blank sheet, and we will make our judgment in due course on the basis of evidence thereafter presented on nothing else. I think a fundamental point for people who are not immediately familiar with law, but in particular international law, is to recognize that international law doesn't necessarily work well or at all. It does work a bit, but it is hamstrung, and one of the reasons it's hamstrung is that many parts of it are subject to severe political interference, either active interference or effective interference, because international judicial bodies are frightened of offending people, have pressure applied to them, whatever else. So we live in a false state of happiness when we think of there being an international order that works, when frankly, in many ways, it simply doesn't. And as a manifestation of its inadequacies, it so happens that for various reasons, if there are nasty things happening in the People's Republic of China now, there is no court to which they can be brought. Not just because of lack of willingness, but because anybody wishing to do that is in some ways snookered, either because China sits, use the word China for shorthand, sits on the Security Council and can block reference to the International Criminal Court, or because it's got a reservation on the Genocide Convention by which it might otherwise be taken to the International Court of Justice. And unless there's some country on its own that is brave enough to take China on, if and when an individual from the government sets foot in its country, there is no other way. So it's either a failed system or an inadequate system, and it doesn't much matter which for these purposes. The result of that is, in my view, the following. The citizen, the public, if you like, may have or does have a duty to know and to react to knowledge. I would argue that the citizen who's capable has a duty to know what is happening to his fellow woman and man, and has a duty to act if that fellow citizen of the world is suffering in a way that can be reduced or eliminated, and that duty arises from the single humanity of which we are all a part. And as long as you have political or legal mechanisms or non-mechanisms that make it impossible for the formal bodies to do something about an apparent suffering in a far-off country by a state, if and as long as you have that, then the citizen who is capable and sufficiently interested actually has a duty to act. And so when People's Tribunals started, they started with a tribunal by Lord Russell into Vietnam. Nobody was going to take on Vietnam. Nobody ever has. There is no evidence-based assessment of criminality by America in Vietnam. Lord Russell started a tribunal in 1966, pretty unsatisfactory in many respects, needn't trouble you with that, but prejudiced and one-sided and all sorts of other things. But that was the start. And what he said, and what Jean-Paul Sartre said, was that, who was one of the members of the tribunal, said, these tribunals fill a void. And that is what the tribunal I head is going to do. There is a void. not, it has to be said, of protestations by governments once, by parliamentarians on more than one occasion about what's happening in northwest China. There's not a lack of that, but there is a complete lack of a public evidence-based assessment of what is happening, so that the citizen, but also corporations, educational establishments, and governments can make the important decisions they each and individually and severally have to make if they are to discharge their universal duties as members of the human race. And that is what people's tribunals do. That's what this one will do.
And what will you do? I mean, give us a kind of pithy summary of what you will do over the 4 days starting on Friday. What would it look like, and what will the end result of the tribunal be?
You need, first of all, obviously, before Friday, there's been a year of work, a great deal of research of all available and known material, securing of witnesses to come and attend, gathering of a team, nearly all pro bono, some junior researchers paid from the funds that have been raised, and the funds have been raised independently of the members of the tribunal. They are not allowed to put money in, and they're not, the senior ones don't take money out, so that there is absolutely no investment in it. But nevertheless, a lot of preparation, a lot of research being done. We'll have 4 days in June and 4 days in September. The evidence, not least thanks to work done by Luke, will include a large number of people, witnesses in person in Church House in London, giving evidence. Their evidence, because of limited time, will necessarily be fairly short, so their witness statements taken in advance and attested to by the witnesses will be the core of their evidence, but they will then be open for questioning. And the questioning will be aimed not just at finding out more than that which is in the witness statement, but also exploring other questions that may occur to the members, and also raising with witnesses anything that has been said negative about those witnesses by China, because they have already started a fairly heavy campaign against us and have had a long campaign against some of those witnesses who've already given the accounts of their suffering in public before. 4 days, at the end of which there will be a pause. To some extent, the pause is logistically necessary, but it's also very helpful because A, if there's additional evidence that people watching it, and it will be streamed around the world, evidence that people think they should raise, they can tell us about it. Perhaps even more valuable, the PRC, China, will be given a chance. They've been given a chance all the way along to join and help and invited to take part. They haven't. But they'll be given a chance, possibly specified chance, to deal with issues raised in the evidence and to come back in September when we'll have 4 more days of other evidence, and to come back and explain why evidence that's been given is incorrect. Why do we do this? Because, of course, in all human rights documents, it is standard that you have to allow the other side to be heard. And so far, China has declined to be heard. We have to do our best to make sure we understand what their case will be, and that's what we do. After that, we will settle down and provide a judgment, we hope, in December. We will limit our judgment. We are not going to overreach and tell the world what to do. We will simply say whether certain crimes have or have not been committed. We will then leave it to others to pick up that nugget of fact.
So now let me return. I mean, obviously, this sort of truth-seeking and truth clarification has enormous value to victims and victim communities, and I've witnessed this in my life, firsthand through the work of the Truth Commission in South Africa. But a primary reason, I should imagine, or a very important reason that we're doing this, that this is being done, is in order to get China to stop doing what it's currently doing and for there to be a fundamental change in the treatment of Uyghurs. And I want to now come back to Luke and ask you a question. Let's presume that the Uyghur Tribunal makes a finding that genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, a raft any or all of those crimes have indeed occurred through the very meticulous and judicious process that Geoffrey has just set out. What is your theory of change? How does that make a difference? And how can that be brought to bear on a juggernaut of a nation with extraordinary economic power, with strong diplomatic influence? How will this truth-telling make a difference, an actual lived difference to the lives of Uyghurs?
Thank you, Paul. It's an excellent question and very, very difficult to unpack and answer. I'm going to approach it in the following way. Governments have different approaches to their international obligations around genocide. Some are willing to make what we would call political declarations of genocide without a court judgment. Some reserve their opinion, waiting for a court judgment. They say, you know, genocide is too big, too important an issue for us to speculate about. It's a matter for judges. We need to have that court judgment and we'll move from there. That's been the UK's position forever. So getting the UK to move on that is really tough. Now, were the UK to start using that term in connection to what's happening in northwest China, it would, we hope, trigger their obligations, their duties under the Genocide Convention and related human rights instruments, not just the Genocide Convention, but the Genocide Convention, as two much more eminent and knowledgeable people on this subject on this call know much better than me, carries with it very, very heavy duties on states. You can't just go around throwing that term around if you're not willing to be bound by the consequences of that. So what does that mean? Well, the case law from the ICJ is relatively clear what it means. It says, this is the Bosnia case, it says that the moment that a state learns of a developing genocide, it has to bring to bear all reasonable means to bring it to an end, all reasonable means it has at its disposal. So what might that mean? We don't really know, because states have never really been willing to engage with this stuff. The UK has never succeeded in declaring a genocide while one was ongoing. The short answer is it needs to do everything it can. What it cannot do is pretend that business is just normal, carry on business as usual, deepening bilateral economic ties, which is what we're currently doing. You have Dominic Raab on the one hand saying industrial scale human rights abuses and torture. And on the other hand, we know that the economic and financial dialogue has been resumed with China, which was paused after the breaching of the Sino-British Joint Declaration. These things are mutually contradictory. That's where we are. So that would be right at the easy end of things that we could do, not do that. And then you can move into individual targeted sanctions, which we've done a bit of. You can move into coordinated sanctions and reducing dependency on China, right the way through to the things that I certainly wouldn't advocate, but have been advocated in the past around humanitarian intervention. So there's a huge spectrum there of things that we can do. We're doing none of them at all. And I think the role of us, of those of us who care about this and are very frustrated by the fact that there is no international route to a court determination that won't be blocked, our role is to make sure that what happens with the Uyghur Tribunal is taken seriously, that the truth that comes out there is so shoved in the face of governments that they can't ignore it. So that's where we take over from the great and impartial and independent work of the tribunal.
Great. So let me come to Helena. You sit in the House of Lords and you've had experience of so many of these questions globally. I want to ask a question which I think is a very tricky question for human rights advocates and activists, and that is the relationship between trade and human rights. Let's presume that, and again, Geoffrey has not made such a finding, his tribunal has not made such a finding, it will only make such a finding based on the facts. But let's presume he makes a finding that genocide has occurred. Let's presume that the UK Parliament reaffirms that finding, and let's presume that the UK government then affirms that finding, and a UK court affirms that a finding. So you would have 4 different fora all affirming of that particular finding. Does it follow, therefore, that the UK should, and other nations, should fundamentally alter its trading relationship with China? And is that where this takes us? And if that were to be the case, there may be some consequences. Climate activists may get less solar panels. and that would be a complex trade-off. So how do we balance these really difficult considerations as people deeply committed to human rights?
Well, of course, you know, the business of trade is very much at the forefront of our government's considerations, as indeed for any governments. And you know, the question then arises: how do you get any kind of change out of China? And I think that you do have to eventually be saying, we now have a finding of a tribunal. We now have and I'm sure that this will be causing a serious set of agitation in China because of the business of the shame and losing face and so on. And so I do, I mean, Geoffrey very properly is saying he's not expressing a view yet on the evidence. I've seen the evidence, I mean, from many different people. And what we are seeing is, you know, not just the children being put into places which are to sort of deracinate them, they're to forget their language, their culture, their religion, and they're to be imbued with Chinese thought. The men who are in the camps we have had evidence of torture, and you've seen drone photographs of them being transported to these places, and it's reminiscent, unfortunately, of pictures going back to the period of the Holocaust. You know, people chained up and being transported by train to these places. We know that women have been raped and that they have been forced and coerced into sterilization programs, and that they've at times been coerced into abortions. They feel that they're having too many children. We've seen destructions of their burial grounds and of their mosques. That can be testified to by drone photographs. So there's a huge amount of evidence. What there isn't, and so some people say this is not genocide, it's crimes against humanity. And I think that we're kind of, it's almost, you know, dancing on the head of a pin here, because our duty under the Genocide Convention is to prevent genocide, not to wait until there are mass graves. And so, as Lucas just said, we should be looking at preventing genocide. Now, I'm hoping that, and we had tried this. I'm hoping that we will use our leverage on trade with China in order to get them to sort of come to the table and have a different kind of conversation, because that's, you know, nothing else has worked. And I know that they claim that they talk about human rights when they meet with their Chinese opposite numbers, but I don't believe they, in the way that one would need to be talking about it. And so I want to see people in Britain, and there's a common thing about, you know, should people be investing in China? The answer to that is no, they shouldn't. We shouldn't. I mean, you really can't be investing in a place that is conducting this kind of mass human rights abuses. You know, if you have ethical standards yourself, money can't be the main consideration. And so I feel quite strongly about it. We put in, David Alton and myself, put together with, and we were advised by eminent other lawyers, so that it wasn't a sort of mad thought, that in fact, if you can't take this to the International Court of Justice, and Geoffrey's explained why that isn't possible for political reasons and because China's on the Security Council, but you also can't get them before the International Criminal Court, individuals. You see, the ICJ, so that people understand, the ICJ is a court for states, conflicts between states. And so a state can take China to the court, but of course they can scupper it by being on the Security Council. And of course they've placed a reservation on so that they're not included in the Genocide Convention. And so the International Criminal Court, you could bring the guy who's running the province of Xinjiang province, who's got a bad record because he ran Tibet before that. So he's had a practice run at doing this kind of thing. Could we get him in front of that court? No, because of course they didn't sign up to the Treaty of Rome. So we have problems. And so then you've got this irony of Dominic Raab and our government saying, we think that it has to be a court. So what we put into the trade bill was an amendment which said, if an issue of genocide is coming before us and there's concern that a genocide might be taking place, the High Court of England and Wales should be able to consider the evidence and see whether it passes the evidential bar, not to decide on a trade issue, because that's for Parliament and for governments, but to decide on whether there is a prima facie case. And once that was established by our courts, then it would fall to government to decide what use they made of that information. And we had great success in the House of Lords, and it went back to the House of Commons, and huge numbers. I mean, the government has a great majority, but it got right down to we only lost some of this thing by 11 votes at one stage. That majority was eroded because so many Conservatives, as well as Labour, Lib Dems, Greens, and so on, everybody was on side in saying, well, let our High Court, if it needs to be a court, let our High Court do it. But the government in the end had its way and prevented that amendment going into the bill.
Right.
So now Geoffrey is doing his tribunal, and I do hope that it has purchase, and I hope that it gets the kind of coverage which we ought to bring that information to the citizens of this country, to, as he says, let them know what the situation is, and that we have duties towards people in the world who are being abused in this way. I just want to finally say, before you move to others, it's interesting. I imagine that people saw that only in this last week, Germany decided to pay reparations to Namibia for the genocide that they committed in Namibia. And that wasn't decided by the International Court of Justice. It's not been decided by any court. They decided it themselves as a matter of policy and as a matter of shame. And I think that, we got to start creating a sort of sense of obligation around these things, and to recognize the wrongs that have been done in the past. You've now got Joe Biden just now visiting a part of the United States. It was a horror story that I'd never heard about. I don't know about others. I had no idea what had happened in Tulsa with the Black community being virtually wiped out, and the silence that there has been around that. And I think that wrongs that have taken place and wrongs that are currently taking place, we have to address if we do believe that human rights have any meaning at all.
Geoffrey, I want to ask you a question about the typology of crimes that are coming before you, particularly crimes against humanity and genocide. And again, without anticipating, you may come to a set of findings not proven, but some people will regard anything less than a finding of genocide as in some way a diminution of the responsibility of the Chinese state and an a failure to properly acknowledge the full gravity of the crimes, as if a mere finding, and I use the word mere advisedly, of crimes against humanity is a slap on the wrist. How do you avoid a sense that anything other than a finding of genocide by your tribunal will cause activists to feel let down, particularly in a context, as Luke has alluded to, that the Genocide Convention gives rise to a set of duties that may not arise in respect of other crimes, and therefore there may be greater consequence for making a genocide finding than another kind of international crime finding?
I don't think there's any problem with the 9 members of the tribunal being true to their commitment simply to find what is proved and to explain if they don't find what it might be thought people would want to be proved, if they explain it fully. The hypothetical situation you raise of genocide not being found could conveniently be explained were that ever to happen, something that has been on the lips of lawyers and academics, practicing and otherwise lawyers, for a decade or more. Genocide is not necessarily the worst of all crimes. It may be as bad as other crimes. It may be less serious than other crimes. Twin Towers, never a genocide. letting off a dirty bomb in London and rendering the place unusable for generations. Never a genocide. So the proper understanding of genocide might be a useful collateral accomplishment to the degree that it ever was in the hypothetical circumstance you describe. And it's interesting to note that genocide codified in 1948 was barely touched until 1993, when it was featured in the Rwanda and Yugoslav ad hoc tribunal statutes. Therefore, people didn't talk about it. They didn't think about it. They didn't use the term. Having been encouraged to use it, you can't blame them using it, and they may use it at the moment over enthusiastically, and so a certain amount of rebalancing might not be a bad idea. But the short answer to your question is, how do we deal with not reacting to expectations or not delivering on expectations? Is, I'm afraid, we just deal with it by being entirely honest with ourselves, with the evidence that comes our way, and with the law as it is. It's quite clear that there are those who would like the definition of genocide to be expanded, and we'll be hearing from them, but they won't be allowed to persuade us that the law is other than it is. We'll deal with the law as it is. May I, before you go to another question or to the audience, just add something to what was said about the effectiveness of any of the judgment, genocide or otherwise, and about what governments should do once they are seized of definitive judgments on what's happening. And it's worth asking yourselves this question, and I detach it from China for obvious reasons and then come back to China. If events in 1930s Germany had not developed to a war as soon as they did, or ever, but the other in parallel activities of what happened to groups of people, communists, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and Jews, slowly became known, would the British public have put up with it if their government said trade comes first? If the general category of things that Helena has described were found now to be happening in France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Spain, or the Republic of Ireland, and the government said, well, bad luck, really. It's not been described by any particular term. We'll just carry on going to holidays to these places. Would the public accept that? And this comes back to my opening observation about the single character of humanity to which we must respond. And our government, if it is seized of information, must respond as if it was happening next door. And the point that's made about the Genocide Convention, Article 1, which says in terms that parties to the convention confirm that genocide, whether committed in time of peace or war, is a crime which they undertake to prevent and to punish. And picking up on the point that was made about the determination of the International Court of Justice, that duty, state duty, bites the second genocide is recognized, is something of very great importance. And I'm afraid it explains why, since Great Britain or United Kingdom reluctantly signed up to the Genocide Convention in 1970, that ever since governments have dodged making a finding about genocide or even about crimes against humanity against another country, because they know that the domino effect of honoring your duty and then his duty and then her duty means that you have to act in ways that they might find inconvenient.
So then let me come back to a question to Luke. And in a way, Maya and Annie and Minka have asked a variant of this question, and it all revolves around the efficacy of sanctions, what can be done, what other measures can be done. And Luke, I want to ask this because it seems from your work with parliaments across the globe, you must have a very keen appreciation of the economics and the politics of this point, because let's presume that Geoffrey is right and these findings shock the conscience of citizens and of the world, and people begin to think about the parallels with Nazi Germany and say that it cannot be business as usual. The dilemma must surely be that this is a country that sells us cheap clothes, gives us our iPhones, gives us our solar panels, and underwrites at some cost a certain amount of the quality of life and convenience that people have grown accustomed to. And so how do you build an effective coalition against this with investors, with CEOs, and with consumers to get people to act when China is so important, either obviously, but also inconspicuously in all of our lives?
Thank you. I think I would just, first of all, point out one very clear example of that phenomenon you were describing being absolutely true. So Magnitsky sanctions, for those who don't know, these are targeted sanctions placed upon individual human rights abusers as opposed to a state or another entity. When the crisis was hitting in Belarus, it took us all of a week and a half to impose sanctions upon the people that we saw were responsible. Whereas it took us at least 18 months of campaigning to get anything out of the UK government as regards human rights abusers, some of the worst guys in China. Why is that? Well, clearly because of the bilateral relationship. Nothing else explains it. Zooming out a bit and looking at the global picture, my experience has been that with more exposed economies, where countries are more exposed to economic coercion from China, those countries are less likely to speak out about China's human rights abuses. I'll go a bit further and say less likely, less able to speak up for their own values. So the argument we've been trying to run with the Interparliamentary Alliance on China is, if your dependency upon this country prevents you from speaking out in defense of human rights, prevents you of criticizing, concentration camps with more than 1 million people in it, then you've got to reduce that dependency. And the big project that we have underway is to assess audit dependency upon China with a view to reducing it. As to whether or not sanctions are effective, I think they're a bit of a cop-out, to be honest. I mean, if the responsibility is with the state, then the state should be held accountable, not just individuals. Magnitsky sanctions are a good way of getting some accountability, but they don't excuse complete inertia when it comes to state accountability. That's where I believe we are with it. So another good example would be the Sino-British Joint Declaration, for those of you not familiar. This was the agreement that was supposed to govern what happened in Hong Kong. And the people of Hong Kong, we made promises to, which are enshrined in law, lodged at the United Nations, to uphold their way of life and autonomy. Well, we haven't done that. We've failed manifestly to do that. You can see from the destruction of Hong Kong's freedoms, we haven't done that. What we've done instead is to open our doors to B&O, British national overseas passport holders who want to come to the UK. Now, I'm in favor of that policy, don't get me wrong, but it's not a substitute for holding China to account. And I think what this shows is that there's a pattern all over the world that shows that dependency upon China is so strong that people are not willing to do that. So I think economic sanctions, which I would dress up slightly differently, I would say that a coordinated effort between democratic nations to reduce dependency upon China would very quickly show China that they can't continue to behave in that way. Right now, they're calling us out, calling our bluff and saying, yeah, okay, you bleat about human rights, but you're doing more business with us. Even the US did that. Their trade with Xinjiang went up something like 236% in 2020, the year that Pompeo was sanctioning left, right, and center. What does that tell you? It tells you that, unfortunately, the bottom line doesn't match the rhetoric, and that's what needs to change.
So there have been some targeted sanctions applied against certain Chinese officials, and the Chinese have responded and imposed their own targeted sanctions, and included amongst those have been both Geoffrey and Helena, who have been subject to sanctions from the Chinese government. And I must say, breaking a lance on their behalf, I don't really think the legal profession in this country has really been a profile in courage in speaking out against such eminent members of the bar being targeted. And in fact, there hasn't really been, there's rather been a deafening silence from members of the bar, partly, I suspect, because of their reliance on getting work with and commercial ties to China. So I come back to this question about professional responsibilities. What should the legal profession be doing? What should investment professionals be doing? If you're thinking about investing in China, should we all now be doing a little bit of a sort of genocide, crimes against humanity audits, to Luke's point about seeking to think carefully about where our responsibilities lie? Helena, what's your view?
Well, I do. I mean, what you express a concern that we're trying to do the right thing on climate change, and yet it's China that is producing all the solar panels. Well, our manufacturing industry could do with a bit of a fillip, and we should actually be encouraging people to set up businesses here in the United Kingdom, making solar panels, so that we can make the choice that we want UK-made solar panels. I just think that. You can find your way around some of this stuff, I mean, one of the things about Xinjiang province is that it is the famous place for really wonderful cottons. It produces cotton of a very good quality, and lots of clothes are made from this, and indeed made there. And so we should be mindful of that in the purchasing of our clothing. Now, the problem about these things, about sanctions, and I share to some degree Luke's concerns. I was always against the classic old-fashioned sanction, which was, we're going to sanction Iran. We're going to bring it to its knees, and then hope that the people rise up because they're feeling the impoverishment that's caused by it, and the same to Russia and so on. And it always seems to me that the wrong people are punished, and that's why I was a great supporter, and I continue to be a great supporter of Magnitsky sanctions, because Magnitsky sanctions came out of the experience of a great banker, Bill Browder's, losing his own lawyer who was murdered in Russian prisons, and he really went on a kind of campaign, has become a real human rights activist, and went from government to government, didn't matter what side of the aisle you were on, and he wooed people into supporting the creation of sanctions against human rights abusers. And it started off with the people who'd caused his own lawyer's death in Russia, but it's now spread to a much more generalized thing of, this is a way of getting at the bad guys. And actually, it does matter if you can get the powerful, and they can't get visas. I mean, an awful lot of powerful people in China own apartments in London, they educate their children here, and so on. And if they suddenly find that actually they aren't going to get visas, and that their assets are going to be frozen, it actually hits them where it matters. And I do think those things have power. But I also agree with Luke that you also have to go to the other place, which is that you really should be able to say to China, you cannot claim to be a global power by disregarding the law, and you yourselves have to be abiding by it. And I think that we don't talk Turkey to them. And I think there was hypocrisy in the Trump administration around all of this, and they were certainly using the human rights thing as a bit of garnish, over their trade wars. But I really do think we have to have a different kind of conversation, and that's what I would want us to try and force them to do. But I just want to say, someone asked a question about the business of sanctions. Sanctions in the end are about trying to give international law some teeth, because of the very thing that Geoffrey said at the very beginning, which is it's so politicized, it's so difficult. And the Belt and Road program, we ourselves have a lot to answer for. We should have ourselves been helping Africa and the developing world to get to a better place, and not allowing globalizations to create this great chasm between the rich and poor, where the numbers of billionaires have multiplied, and yet enough money hasn't been given to Africa to build up its own infrastructure and to create avenues towards greater wealth. So I have to say, I feel very strongly that it's our own fault, and we should not have allowed that door to be open for China to walk into Africa and other places.
I have two final questions to get us out of here on time. Geoffrey, in our preparation session, you made what I thought was a classically judicious point about due process when it comes to the application of these individual sanctions, and whether or not there should be a right of complaint or a right of review or an opportunity to submit evidence why you should not be targeted in this way. And I thought it would be a useful thing for people to hear that, because I think it's a sign of balance and worth thinking about. And I'll come to Luke in the end.
Yeah, we pride ourselves on the rule of law, but with what level of sincerity is hard to know, because we imposed Magnitsky sanctions without giving those eventually sanctioned a right to appear, a right to answer. And then we find when the same thing is done to us, to me and to Helena, that, wow, our families, not only ours are affected without an argument, but apparently our families are all affected. They're not allowed to travel. And members of the tribunal, who knows, they're affected as well. So it's very important to bear in mind that if you say you believe in the rule of law, then that does mean to say you've got to be even-handed about it. And in a way, I'd just like to make one comment. When the sanctions were imposed, the 5 city inner circle law firms said not a thing. The vast majority of the barristers and solicitors said not a thing. The Inner Temple spoke up, good for it, happens to be mine, but not at my instigation. The Bar Council spoke up, and 1 or 2 others. Go and ask a barrister when you meet one, or a solicitor, are you active in the support of free speech? If you did not, the day those sanctions were announced, do something to support those who were sanctioned. Because if they didn't, then they argue free speech for others, but only when it's not inconvenient do they argue it more generally.
And Luke, I'm going to come to you, because you also in preparation made a very interesting point about UK universities and their reliance on Chinese students, but also being other bastions of free speech. I wonder, in your engagement or your reflections on how dealing with China around these issues is going to create dilemmas for UK universities who are so reliant on foreign Chinese students for tuition and revenue and other things.
Thanks. Yeah, this is a very difficult subject because you may have seen that there is a huge upsurge in the number of racist attacks against people of East and Southeast Asian origin. For some reason, people seem incapable of distinguishing people of Chinese descent from the Chinese Communist Party. So I want to say at the outset that I hate all that Reds under the bed stuff. Absolutely loathe it. And I think the government needs to be doing more in order to raise awareness that the Chinese Communist Party and people of East and Southeast Asian origin are not the same thing. So I just want to preface what I say with that. But the Chinese Communist Party tries to conflate people and party. That's one of their big selling points. They believe that even people born outside of China, if they're of that origin, are forever Chinese. And it is increasingly a nationalistic state. So it likes to claim, it's ethno-nationalistic. It likes to claim that the Han majority is in some way supreme. So this is what people had always called Han chauvinism, very strongly present within the thinking of the Chinese Communist Party, and arguably to an extent within Xi Jinping's thought. So that's a long kind of introduction to say we've got an issue because there's a deliberate conflation going on. So universities that are very nice to China get more students. The Russell Group of universities now averages at 20% foreign students. They pay much more money. And the relationship between some of our universities in China is far too cozy. They have campuses out there, and there are great difficulties on campus. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. A couple of years ago, when the Hong Kong protests were at their height, some Hong Kong students were wanting to demonstrate on campus. number of campuses around the country this happened, and there were counter demonstrations from those loyal to Beijing. In every case, the university sided with the Beijing side, in every case, and tried to silence the presumed dissenters, those who were fighting for democracy, the things that we actually legally promised to uphold in Hong Kong. Those were the guys that were shut up. This is a real issue. If our universities are not supported enough by their own government or by students from elsewhere, they will become increasingly dependent on a cash-rich China who is sending lots of students over. I don't want to punish Chinese students. I want them to come here and get a good education. But if we end up in a situation where, like, for example, Cambridge University Press has to withdraw a publication that is critical of Xi Jinping under pressure, it's too much. If you have a China Centre at Jesus College, Cambridge, which doesn't want to host any events that are critical of China about their human rights, it's too much. We need to preserve academic free speech. Just an example from only last week, when an event was held, organized by students, that was critical of China around Uyghurs. What actually happened at that event was that the Deputy Foreign Minister turned up to it and was very argumentative throughout in the chat box. You can bet your bottom dollar who's making a careful note who was there. That's directly in tension with this principle of free speech, with this principle of academic freedom, and we can't allow it. So for all of those reasons, we've got a problem that needs to be faced up to around our universities.
So we are out of time. I wanted to conclude by thanking all of you, not just for your enormous eloquence in this session, but for what you do, because my life experience has been that active people and activists make change, and you are driving forward a conversation that I think is insufficiently on the agenda, and are bringing facts to our consciousness which may cause us to act differently, and that acting differently may have very dramatic impacts on the lives of the Uyghurs. So anybody who doesn't yet have enough knowledge, watch the Uyghur Tribunal, listen carefully to their pronouncements, and I am certain of one thing, that you will regard their pronouncements as fair, and they will stand up to scrutiny. And it is one of the reasons we set up the Conduit, is to have conversations like this, because it is through these conversations that we leave the world better and more decent and more just. So thank you to all of you who've both listened and who've participated, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you very much indeed.
Goodbye.